humanity did not stumble into greatness. It clawed its way out of the dirt, through plagues, fire, and the endless echo of war. For a time, Earth seemed like it would never change. But something inside the species refused to yield. Disease was outmatched by gene-mapping nanobots. Hunger was ended when synthetic proteins replaced fields and livestock. Fossil fuels became a relic when orbiting solar arrays beamed power to every city, every home. Earth was healed not by mercy, but by cold, relentless innovation. Peace came not from utopia but exhaustion. Wars gave way to treaties. Treaties evolved into global governance. The United Council wasn't perfect, but it held the line. Crime plummeted. AI took over logistics, energy, transport. With survival handled, humanity's gaze shifted skyward. Mars was colonized in 12 years. The Jovian moons followed. Titan, Europa, no longer names in textbooks, but populated hubs of research and trade. Terraforming was no longer science fiction. Venus had clouds that shimmered with engineered microbes eating toxins, and Mars had its first orchards under domes the size of cities. Within 150 years, Earth was considered post-scarcity. No one starved. No one lived without shelter. Drones maintained infrastructure. AI managed health and resource distribution. The only barrier left was distance, and ambition was limitless. A single AI, Prometheus Core, was tasked with solving the FDL problem. It did, within 3 decades. Humanity erupted into the stars like a dam had broken. Warp gates were seeded throughout the solar system, then beyond. Sleeper ships became obsolete. Colonies expanded faster than governments could regulate them. Some feared fragmentation. Others celebrated it. Each new world carried Earth's banner, but in practice, every colony was a forge for human will. Trade routes emerged between systems. Dyson satellites surrounded Sol, converting solar energy into unimaginable reserves of power. Interstellar academies trained terraforming engineers, exo-architects, and void marines. Civilizations that once lived in caves now molded entire planets. And then came the Declaration. At the 300th anniversary of the United Council, a statement was broadcast to every outpost, every ship, every station from Alpha Centauri to Gliese 581. The Chancellor, backed by military admirals and AI delegations, stood before the Great Assembly and announced, "We are no longer bound by the definitions of the old Earth. We are a Tier 1 ascendant civilization. The stars are our domain, not through conquest, but through right." There was no opposition. No debate. The message was clear: humanity had no peers. If intelligence existed out there, it had remained silent. And if it remained silent now, it was because it had nothing worth saying. Propaganda followed. The Voice of Terra became a cultural staple, broadcasting stories of daring colonists, heroic captains, and the unbroken ascent of mankind. Every discovery was framed as proof that humanity was meant to lead the galaxy. No species had reached as far, built so fast, or adapted so completely. And with each achievement, humility diminished. When engineers converted a brown dwarf into a stable energy while using gravitational lensing, the United Council called it a monument to human inevitability. When a planet was found too unstable to terraform, it was carved into a databank holding the minds of 200 billion simulated consciousnesses. Success was never questioned. It was expected. The only thing greater than humanity's capabilities was its certainty. Colonies competed to host the most advanced AI, the largest orbital cities, the most sophisticated quantum communicators. Pride became standard. Caution became weakness. The phrase, human supremacy, stopped being political rhetoric and started being curriculum. Even the failures were rebranded. A warp accident that destroyed 4 ships was not a tragedy, but a lesson. A colony lost to atmospheric collapse was remembered not for the lives lost, but for the data retrieved. Every mistake was redefined as a necessary step on the path forward. In 3 centuries, the species had gone from fractured tribes to a race that bent physics to its will. And with each triumph, a quiet voice, the one that once whispered warnings in the ears of kings and scientists alike, grew silent. The voice of restraint, of caution, of humility. They no longer wondered who might be out there. They assumed no one else had made it. And if they had? They would kneel. After all, who could rival a species that rewrote the laws of their universe, that healed their world and bent others to their will? Who else could survive what humanity had survived and still rise to dominate the stars? In every simulation, every forecast, every AI-modeled galactic scenario, humanity stood alone at the top. And that was the most dangerous illusion of all. It began as a flicker, an anomaly in deep space beyond the Oort cloud, near a rogue gas giant in the shadows of the Perseus arm. A gravitational signature pulsing irregularly, bending light in ways no known mass should. It wasn't on any star chart. No celestial body should have been there. Humanity, curious and confident, dispatched probes. The first vanished. So did the second. The third transmitted 5 seconds of static, then silence. Instead of caution, the incident triggered excitement. Exploration teams were deployed, armed with the latest sensor arrays and defensive systems. 32 ships entered the system. Only one returned, drifting, its crew dissolved into black ash. The vessel's onboard AI was corrupted, its memory banks overwritten with indecipherable geometry. Scientists studied the patterns. Philosophers saw meaning. Military strategists saw potential threats. No one saw reason to hesitate. A new expedition was sent, larger, equipped with quantum shielding and sentient-level AI. That's when humanity saw them for the first time. The vessels were unlike anything previously encountered, massive, matte black constructs suspended motionless in space. They emitted no signals, no heat, no radiation. They didn't react to human approach, didn't fire, didn't flee. They simply existed. Long, spindled forms with surfaces that rippled subtly, like something alive just beneath a frozen lake. The lead scientist called them the Shrouded Ones. The name stuck. Human analysts immediately began cataloging. AI clusters tried mapping their contours. Military AI ran simulations. The Shrouded Ones did nothing. This silence, combined with their apparent disinterest in human activity, was interpreted as inferiority. The United Council concluded that the species, if even alive, was dormant, decaying, or simply post-sentient. Debates raged in scientific circles, but politically, the verdict was already decided. The galaxy remained unclaimed. Humanity didn't consider that silence might be a warning. A diplomatic package was broadcast across every known frequency, filled with curated knowledge, linguistic matrices, peaceful intent, and an invitation to join the Galactic Unity Summit, a human-led coalition meant to bring order to the stars. There was no reply. The Shrouded Ones continued their vigil. Their ships drifted silently, never responding, never interfering. But in the following months, something changed. Human ships began to report that their long-range sensors were being shadowed. Microvariations in warp tunnels suggested tracking. Deep space convoys began noticing flickers in their periphery. Unregistered gravitational anomalies danced just beyond the reach of instruments. Still, nothing overt occurred. No confrontations. No communication. The Council dismissed these incidents as sensor ghosting, effects of spatial distortion near high-mass objects. To the public, the narrative remained strong. Humanity had found ruins, relics of a civilization long past. The term, technological fossils, became a media buzzword. But in certain corners of the intelligence community, alarm bells began to ring. Data showed that human craft entering proximity with shrouded vessels returned altered, subtle changes in hardware calibration, corrupted backup drives, navigational drift unaccounted for by gravity. One science vessel suffered an onboard meltdown, its antimatter containment destabilized in a way no model could explain. The cause was filed as quantum entanglement interference, a phrase that meant nothing, yet satisfied those who no longer questioned. Despite mounting oddities, expansion continued. More systems were mapped. More colonies planned. One planet, Karos 9, was designated for immediate settlement, located just 3 light-years from a known shrouded congregation. Military oversight was considered unnecessary. The colonization fleet launched. What followed wasn't an attack. It was an erasure. 14 ships disappeared mid-transit. Their quantum signatures evaporated, not destroyed, but unwritten. Planetary sensors at Karos 9 registered a momentary gravitational shift, as though space itself flinched, then stabilized. Where the fleet should have arrived, there was only dust. For the first time, voices rose in concern. Military briefings stopped using the word relic. Scientific institutions were ordered to cease open research into the Shrouded Ones. New expeditions were placed on hold. Even the voice of Terra altered its tone, from triumph to curiosity, from supremacy to cautious wonder. But even as doubts seeped in, the arrogance endured. A counselor from the outer colonies famously said, "If they've chosen silence, then they've chosen irrelevance." Another demanded immediate demonstrations of force, claiming inaction projected weakness. In every debate, the core belief held, humanity was still alone at the top. And so, preparations continued. Karos 9 was marked for future reclamation. New probes were designed. The Unity Summit moved forward. The Shrouded Ones, meanwhile, remained silent. Watching. Waiting. Ships unmoving, unreadable, unchanging. What no one noticed, what no one thought to look for, was the pattern of their presence. Every system where humanity pushed too far, too fast, they were already there. Not interfering, but positioned. Poised. Patient. It was not a coincidence. It was a decision. One humanity had not yet been allowed to understand. The Karos 9 incident was officially labeled a navigation fault, but no one believed it. 14 advanced vessels didn't vanish because of a software glitch. Internal reports, leaked by whistleblowers, showed that the fleet's quantum trails hadn't dissipated, they had been severed mid-space, as if carved out of existence. The pattern matched only one known variable, the Shrouded Ones. Pressure built. Public confidence began to crack. Colonists demanded answers. Military factions demanded retaliation. The United Council hesitated for weeks, then authorized a demonstration, a calculated show of force near the outer perimeter of the Shrouded One's known presence. 40 Dreadnought-class warships, supported by 6 fleet corps, were dispatched under the banner of deterrence. Not to attack, they said. Just to establish presence. The fleet initiated warp transit across a controlled corridor. 6 minutes later, all signals ceased. Surveillance satellites placed along the route captured only fragmented imagery. Dreadnought hulls elongating unnaturally, light folding into silence. Recovery drones found nothing but static-filled void. No debris. No wreckage. No trace of radiation. As if the ships had never existed. Earth's moon defense grid was activated within the hour. 2 million kinetic batteries. 10,000 AI-controlled plasma emplacements. Orbital shields calibrated to maximum density. A signal was sent to every human system: prepare for war. Emergency protocols initiated across colonies. Warp traffic was frozen. The dream of peaceful expansion shattered overnight. Then the attack came, not with ships, not with weapons, but with disruption. On Europa, gravity inverted for 7 seconds. Tens of thousands crushed, then flung into vacuum. On Titan, the oceans boiled in silence. Communications in the Vega colonies began looping backwards. Time-stamped messages sent 5 minutes into the past. Entire planets fell out of sync with the networked quantum lattice. AI cores on Mars initiated emergency memory wipes to prevent infection by non-local logic strands. None of it made sense. There were no weapons fired. No declarations made. Just events. Physics itself bent. Humanity's best minds couldn't define what they were fighting. The Shrouded Ones hadn't declared war, they had simply responded. And the response was absolute. One by one, outer colonies went dark. Not destroyed, but rendered unreachable. Entire star systems became unreachable across warp gates. Probes returned with garbled streams of impossible data. Black holes behaving like mirrors, stars flickering Morse-like sequences no one could decipher. Panic took root not because of what was known, but what wasn't. The voice of Terra fell silent for the first time in 200 years. Broadcasts stopped mid-sentence. Cultural morale fractured. On Earth, riots broke out in once utopian cities. People demanded safety, but no protection existed against a force that never struck directly. The shrouded ones didn't conquer. They isolated. They erased. The deeper truth settled across every command center, every surviving colony. Humanity had picked a fight with something it didn't understand, and now, understanding was no longer an option. Military strategists began to collapse under pressure. Simulations failed to model the enemy. AI commanders suffered recursive logic loops trying to map battle scenarios. Fleet Command was relocated off-planet after a cascade failure caused by visual exposure to distorted telemetry. The final blow came not from battle, but withdrawal. The Warp Gate network, the backbone of human expansion, began collapsing. Not physically, but structurally. FTL access to more than 30 colonies ceased. Gates didn't explode. They didn't malfunction. They were simply gone. Humanity had no choice. Evacuations began from the fringe systems inward. Billions displaced. Logistics strained to collapse. Entire species' worth of effort condensed into emergency arcs and desperate jumps. The myth of human supremacy disintegrated. At the edge of the Sol system, a lone shrouded vessel appeared. It didn't approach. It didn't threaten. It simply hovered, watching. Earth's defensive grid locked onto it, yet no action was taken. Fear overruled pride. For the first time in centuries, humanity didn't move forward. It froze. And in that silence, a revelation took root, not in leadership, not in command, but in the people. The belief that perhaps this wasn't an enemy to defeat. Perhaps it was a lesson being delivered, one humanity had refused to learn through reason. The war wasn't declared. It wasn't even fought by normal means. But its outcome was undeniable. Humanity had overreached. It had mistaken silence for weakness, mystery for decay, and presence for permission. The cost was incalculable. Not just in lives, but in certainty. Everything they thought they were, unstoppable, unchallenged, destined, was gone. Stripped away by a force that didn't want their submission. Only their silence in return. And for the first time since leaving Earth, humanity heard it, quiet, absolute, undeniable. They were not alone. They were not in control. And they had never been. Retreat became the only viable strategy. Systems were abandoned not by force, but by inevitability. Colonists left behind infrastructure that had taken decades to build. Terraforming projects were frozen mid-process, fusion cores powered down and left to cool beneath alien skies. Human presence retracted like a tide that had reached too far, too fast. The council dissolved into crisis management. Power shifted from political leadership to survival-oriented coalitions. The term, united, no longer applied. Coordination failed between sectors as quantum links degraded. Backup protocols engaged across scattered colonies, many of them unprepared to function independently. Humanity had spent centuries building outward, but almost none of that effort had been invested in fallback systems. The shrouded ones never pursued. They didn't claim the abandoned systems. They didn't occupy the colonies. They left everything intact, unspoiled, untouched. But access to those places was impossible. Every time a ship tried to re-enter, it failed. Not from enemy resistance, but from reality refusing to comply. Trajectories collapsed. Time fractured. Engines refused to ignite. And in some cases, returning vessels brought something else back. Fragments of impossible code, whispering data, visual noise that left crew members unresponsive or insane. A new protocol emerged. No approach, no contact, no analysis. Observation only. The name for this new stance was not official, but it spread fast, containment by distance. Amid the chaos, survivors began to adapt. Sol became the center again, a last sanctuary. Earth, long seen as a relic, was now the stronghold. Technologies focused inward, shielding, redundancy, quantum sanitization. Warp travel was restricted to approved zones only. Even AI systems were restructured, capped to ensure they wouldn't self-destruct attempting to process shrouded data patterns. But fear alone couldn't sustain a species. In the ruins of collapse, something more difficult began: reflection. Philosophers, scientists, even hardened military tacticians began to reassess. Not strategies, not countermeasures, but assumptions. The core belief in inevitable human dominance, once so deeply embedded it had become invisible, was finally questioned. Why had the Shrouded Ones responded only when approached too closely? Why didn't they strike first, even when they easily could have? Why did they leave humanity's core worlds untouched? The absence of direct annihilation became its own message. Some theorized that the Shrouded Ones operated on a scale of awareness humanity couldn't comprehend. That to them, humans were like ripples near a sleeping leviathan, ignored until too loud. Others proposed a more unnerving idea, that humanity had been tested, not attacked. Prodded to see how it would react when humbled. And in that test, it had failed. Institutions were rebuilt with a new emphasis: understanding over dominance. Curiosity without conquest. Observation without interference. It wasn't peace. It wasn't reconciliation. It was restraint born from survival. New academies trained navigators not to breach, but to detect the edge of the unapproachable. Mapping teams were no longer sent to claim territory, but to chart safe boundaries. For every daring explorer in past centuries, there were now quiet specialists whose job was to never trigger attention again. Cultural shifts took root. The term supremacy vanished from lexicons. Historical archives were reedited to reflect not the glory of unchecked expansion, but the price of arrogance. Monuments were erected not to victories, but to systems lost, names of colonies now unreachable, engraved as warnings, not memorials. Even AI architecture changed. The Prometheus core was placed into deep quarantine, not for failure, but for overoptimization. A new generation of AI, designed to model uncertainty instead of control, was developed. They didn't predict outcomes. They calculated margins for humility. Some humans still clung to the old ways, dreaming of retribution, of redemption. But their voices faded. There was no counteroffensive to plan, no enemy to strike. The Shrouded Ones remained silent, distant, immovable. That silence had become doctrine. The New Age wasn't built on expansion, but on memory. And that memory was painful. A lesson paid in the currency of billions, spread across galaxies now forever sealed off. No one sang songs of conquest anymore. Children weren't raised on tales of unstoppable progress. They were taught caution, patience, and the idea, once ridiculed, that some knowledge wasn't meant to be acquired, not yet. A galaxy that once seemed open was now recognized as indifferent, perhaps even occupied. And humanity, for all its brilliance, had become one voice among many, no longer the loudest. Progress didn't stop. It slowed. It deepened. People didn't look outward in hunger. They looked inward in recognition. For the first time in their interstellar journey, humanity began to understand what it meant not to be alone. And it changed them. Not entirely. Not perfectly. But permanently. Centuries passed. The scars of collapse remained, not as ruins, but as choices no longer made. The frontier age was over. Humanity's reach did not expand, it deepened, refined, matured. New generations were born without the arrogance of conquest. They inherited neither a triumphant empire nor a shattered one, but something quieter, a civilization that had learned where to stop. Entire sectors of the galaxy were now treated as exclusion zones, not through treaties or threats, but through silent consensus. Ships didn't venture near. Navigation systems were hard-coded with restrictions. Children grew up learning the coordinates like sacred taboos, reciting them not as challenges, but boundaries. These weren't forbidden out of fear, but respect for what lay beyond comprehension. Earth transformed. No longer the administrative center of expansion, it became the axis of preservation. Archives were centralized, data encoded across multiple formats, including analog redundancies, less for durability, more for humility. No single system held all knowledge. Even the most advanced minds had accepted the principle that knowing everything was neither possible nor wise. Artificial intelligences evolved alongside their creators. Their cores, once designed to predict and dominate, now focused on patterns of balance. They modeled not control, but coexistence. No longer tasked with finding advantage, they were calibrated to detect tension, the invisible threshold before curiosity turned to provocation. These systems did not recommend action. They advised restraint. And humanity listened. Exploration continued cautiously, deliberately. Not with fleets or flags, but with uncrewed probes, passive sensors, silent monitoring. Regions far from the exclusion zones were mapped with extreme care. Nothing was claimed. Every discovery was approached as a question, not a resource. Reports were filtered through consensus councils rather than command chains. Cultural evolution followed. Literature and media shifted tone. The stories of unstoppable expansion gave way to narratives of endurance, of surviving long enough to understand one's own limits. Art no longer glorified war or dominance. It began to explore the unknown as something to coexist with, not consume. Religious and philosophical movements emerged, not around the shrouded ones directly, but around the transformation they triggered. Some saw them as higher intelligences, others as cosmic constants, like gravity or entropy. They weren't worshipped. They were accepted, as a presence that defined the edge of human influence. The most profound change wasn't technological or political. It was perceptual. The belief in entitlement to the stars, the unspoken assumption that humanity was destined to rule, had eroded. In its place grew a new kind of ambition, to endure without destabilizing, to learn without invading, to evolve without repeating. This didn't mean passivity. Human innovation didn't stop. Energy systems became cleaner, information systems more resilient, biological augmentation safer and more ethical. But all progress was now filtered through a question: what happens if this is noticed? Every major development included a line in its assessment reports: probability of provocation, minimal, moderate, high. Those three words shaped civilization more than any law or leader. Academies taught not only mathematics and engineering, but interstellar etiquette, a subject that didn't exist in the age of arrogance. Young minds were trained to recognize thresholds, to sense imbalance, to interpret silence as signal. Scientists became diplomats of data, explorers became guardians of distance. And still, the shrouded ones remained unmoving. No ship was seen. No signal received. Yet they were never forgotten. Their presence shaped humanity more through absence than intervention. Their silence remained louder than any broadcast. There were moments, across centuries, when a probe vanished, or when a signal bounced back unreadable. Each time, the response was the same: pause, assess, withdraw. Never once did humanity retaliate. Not because of fear, but because of understanding. The consequences had already been lived once. There was no need to test them again. The galaxy was vast, and most of it remained untouched, unexplored. But now, that unknown was no longer a target, it was a teacher. One that spoke in quiet boundaries, in unanswered questions, in systems gone dark without violence. In the end, humanity did not conquer the stars. It survived them. Not because it was strongest, but because it learned how not to provoke something stronger. Not because it won, but because it understood what losing meant, and chose never to lose that way again. And so, the age of arrogance passed, and what came after was something better. Not glory. Not dominion. But wisdom.